She dropped the storage unit key on the table like it was a piece of trash she was finally getting rid of. $48 a month in unpaid fees, 3 years of abandoned inventory, and she was selling the whole thing. Unit, contents, and whatever was rotting inside, for $2,000 cash. The district manager of Covington Self-Storage, a woman named Patricia Dale, had laughed when she said it. Actually laughed right there in the parking lot, with 2 of her staff watching from the office window. "It's a courtesy offer," she told him. "We're doing you a favor." The young man standing across from her in work boots that had cracked along the left sole didn't ask what the favor was. He just looked at the padlock in her hand and said he'd take it. Isaiah Pruett was 22 years old. He had $2,100 in a bank account he'd been building since he was 16, doing whatever work he could find in Macon, Georgia. Lawn care in the summer, moving furniture on weekends, fixing small appliances for neighbors who didn't want to pay a shop rate. He had never been to college. He had applied to 2 trade programs and been waitlisted on both. He still lived in the same house where he had grown up, in a neighborhood on the east side of the city where the roads hadn't been repaved in a decade, and the closest grocery store was a 40-minute bus ride away. What Isaiah had, the thing no one had ever thought to ask about, was his grandfather's education. Clarence Pruett had spent 40 years repairing antique furniture. Not refinishing, not flipping, repairing. He had worked out of a small shop on the south side of Macon that closed the year Isaiah turned 12. Not because the business failed, but because Clarence's hands finally did. Arthritis had taken the fine motor work first, then the grip, and eventually the ability to hold a brush steady enough to do what he loved. The shop closed on a Thursday. Clarence came home that evening, sat in the kitchen, and for the first time in Isa's memory, didn't say anything at all. But before the shop closed, there had been years of teaching. Clarence was the kind of man who's explained things once and then handed you the tool. He taught Isaiah how to read the grain of wood, the way other grandfathers taught boys to read a river. He taught him which joints were structural and which were decorative, what the underside of a drawer could tell you about the decade a piece was built in, how to match stain by eye in natural light. He said a piece of furniture that had lasted 100 years wanted to last another 100, and that the restorer's job was simply not to get in the way of that. Isaiah had heard all of it. He had kept it the way you keep something you don't know you'll need until the moment arrives. The unit was on the outer row of Covington Self-Storage, Unit 114, at the far end of a corridor that didn't get much foot traffic. The facility had flagged it for non-payment 14 months earlier. The original tenant, a man named Walter Osei, who had run an estate liquidation business before moving out of state, had stopped responding to notices. After the legal holding period, Covington had the right to sell the contents. Patricia Dale had held an auction. No one showed up. She dropped the price. Still nothing. When Isaiah's neighbor, a retired auctioneer named Frank, who occasionally passed along odd leads, mentioned the unit to him over a back fence conversation on a Sunday morning, Isaiah had been quiet for a moment. "What's inside?" he asked. Frank shrugged. "East stuff. Old furniture. Probably junk." Isaiah asked where it was. He drove past the storage facility twice before going in. He parked at the end of the lot and sat in his truck for a few minutes. Doing math he already knew the answer to. $2,000 was essentially everything he had. It was rent money, food money, the small buffer he had kept between himself and the kind of emergency that could end things. Spending it on a locked unit he hadn't seen the inside of was exactly the kind of thing people in his family had been warned against for generations. He went in anyway. Patricia Dale met him at the office with the energy of someone who had already decided how the conversation would end. She was professional in the way people are professional when they don't particularly respect the person they're being professional toward. Answers given quickly, eye contact minimal, papers slid across the counter rather than handed. She walked him to Unit 114 and cut the facility's override lock. The door rolled up with a sound like a slow exhale. The smell came first, cedar and something older, the particular dryness of wood that has been sealed away from humidity for a long time. Isaiah stood in the entrance and let his eyes adjust. The unit was stacked from floor to ceiling. Furniture packed tightly with moving blankets, cardboard corners, and shrink wrap. A chest of drawers near the door. Chairs stacked seat to seat. The outline of something tall and narrow along the back wall. He didn't start unwrapping things. He walked the perimeter of what he could see, reading the shapes, the proportions, the visible edges where blankets had shifted. He crouched down to look at the leg of a chair near the front. The turning on it was hand-done. He could tell by the slight irregularities in the profile that no two repetitions were identical, which meant a lathe operator working by feel rather than a machine running a template. He looked at the back wall again. Patricia Dale was checking something on her phone. He stood up. "I'll take it," he said. She looked up, not quite hiding her surprise, and then covered it with a small smile. "Smart move," she said, in the tone of someone who didn't mean it. He paid in cash. She processed the paperwork in less than 15 minutes. Before she handed him the key, she looked at him with the specific expression of someone about to say something generous. "There's probably some good scrap in there," she told him. "Wood prices aren't bad right now." He took the key. His cousin Devin was waiting in the truck. Devin was 25, worked at a warehouse on the north side, and had agreed to help on the condition that Isaiah buy him lunch. When Isaiah got back to the truck and sat down, Devin looked at his face. "You bought it," Devin said. "Yeah. How much is in your account right now?" "About $100. Devin stared at the windshield for a long time. Then he started the truck. They unloaded the unit over 2 weekends, piece by piece, into the garage at Clarence's house, where the old shop equipment was still stored, and where the smell of linseed oil had never quite left the walls. Isaiah's grandfather sat in a folding chair at the garage door and watched without speaking while they carried things in. When they set down a wide mahogany sideboard with inlaid banding along the top edge, Clarence leaned forward slightly. He didn't say anything. He reached out with his left hand, the one that still had some grip, and ran 2 fingers along the inlay. He looked at Isaiah. "Where did you say you got this?" he asked. "Storage unit." Clarence looked at the sideboard for another long moment. Then he sat back. "Get me my magnifying glass," he said. The glass was on the shelf inside where it had been since the shop closed. Isaiah got it and brought it out. Clarence held it over the corner joint of the sideboard and was quiet for nearly a full minute. "This is hand-cut dovetail," he said. "American, probably late 1800s. Whoever owned this didn't know what they had. Isaiah didn't say anything." "Start uncovering the rest," Clarence said. It took 3 hours. By the time they had unwrapped everything, the garage held 14 pieces, a sideboard, 2 sets of dining chairs, 8 total, a lady's writing desk with a fitted interior and its original brass hardware, a bookcase with leaded glass doors, a blanket chest in tiger maple with a painted interior, a secretary desk with a fold-down writing surface and small interior drawers, a matching pair of parlor chairs in walnut with their original needlepoint upholstery, faded but intact, and against the back wall, wrapped in 3 layers of moving blankets and a furniture pad that had been taped shut, a highboy chest in cherry wood, 7 drawers, bonnet top with carved rosettes. Clarence sat with the magnifying glass for a long time with the highboy. He ran his fingers along the bonnet curve. He opened 2 of the drawers and looked at the runners. He looked at the feet, which were the original ball and claw type, all 4 present and undamaged. "This piece," Clarence said, "is either a very good period reproduction or the real thing. And I have looked at a lot of furniture in my life, and I don't think it's a reproduction." Isaiah looked at his grandfather's face, which was the face of a man trying to stay calm about something that was making it difficult. "What period?" Isaiah asked. "Newport, Rhode Island, mid-1700s. What's that worth?" Clarence looked at him. "If it's what I think it is and it's documented, you're looking at something that belongs in a museum or at Christie's." He paused. "Possibly 6 figures." Devin was standing in the doorway with a bottle of water he hadn't opened. He looked at the highboy. He looked at Clarence. He looked at Isaiah. "I need some air," Devin said. Isaiah stood in the garage after Devin went outside. He looked at the 14 pieces arranged around the space his grandfather had spent 40 years in. He thought about the $100 in his bank account. He thought about Patricia Dale's voice when she said the word scrap. He thought about his grandfather's 2 fingers along the inlay of the sideboard. Then he went to get Clarence's notebook from the shelf inside. A composition book with a cracked spine that Clarence had used to record measurements, finishes, and reference notes for the last 30 years of his working life. And he came back out and opened it to a blank page. "Tell me what each one needs," he said. The first month was an exercise in restraint Isaiah hadn't known he was capable of. He had no money for materials and no tools beyond what was already in Clarence's garage. He cleaned each piece without product, using only slightly damp cloths and careful attention. He documented everything with a cheap digital camera he borrowed from a neighbor. He researched in the evenings on his laptop, cross-referencing what Clarence had taught him with auction records, museum catalogs, and collector forums he'd been reading casually for years without anyone knowing he read them. He couldn't eat well. He ate what was in the house and what Clarence's neighbor, Mrs. Audrey, brought over when she noticed things were thin. Collard greens and cornbread, left at the back door without announcement, the way people in that neighborhood had always helped each other without making it an occasion. He applied for a business license under the name Pruett Restoration. He opened a separate account with $11. Devin came back the second week. He didn't bring it up again, the calculation he'd done in his head the day they unloaded the unit. He just came and helped, because that was how Devin had always operated, skeptical until something was real, and then all in. The first professional contact Isaiah made was through the collector forums. He posted a careful description of the writing desk, not the highboy, not yet, with 3 photographs taken in natural light the way Clarence had taught him to document pieces. He listed its dimensions, the visible construction details, the condition of the hardware. He wrote 1 paragraph. He did not mention price. A man named Howard Breck contacted him within 4 days. Breck was an antiques dealer based in Savannah with a long professional history and a reputation Isaiah had read about in forum threads. He was the kind of dealer who could end a conversation with 2 sentences or open a door with 1. His message was short. He asked if the piece was still available and whether he could arrange an inspection. Isaiah said yes. Breck arrived on a Thursday morning in a truck that was clean and practical and not ostentatious. He was perhaps 65, with the precise way of moving that people develop when they have spent decades around fragile things. He went to the writing desk first, which Isaiah had positioned near the garage door in good light. He looked at it for a while without touching it. Then he began examining it carefully, systematically, the way Clarence had taught Isaiah to examine pieces, starting with the exterior and working inward. He looked up at Isaiah at one point during the interior examination. "Where did you train?" he asked. Isaiah told him about Clarence. He told it plainly, without embellishment, the way his grandfather told things. Breck listened without looking up from the desk. He kept working through the interior drawers. "This is a very good piece," Breck said when he was finished. "Probably Connecticut, late Federal period. The hardware is original, which is unusual." He named a price. It was not what Isaiah had hoped for, but it was several times what a furniture flipper would have paid, and it was real money in a real account, offered by a person who knew what he was looking at. Isaiah said he'd like one day to think about it. Breck looked at him then, with the particular attention of someone recalibrating what they're dealing with. "Take 2, he said. Isaiah sold the desk the following day for the offered price. He called Breck back and was accepted. The check cleared in 3 days. He did not celebrate. He made a list of what the other 13 pieces needed. He bought supplies. He paid back the small amounts he had borrowed from Clarence for gas and food. He set the remainder aside as operating capital and wrote the number in the back of Clarence's composition book. Devin saw the number when he came by that Saturday. He sat down on the workbench and looked at it for a moment. "All right," he said. "What do you need me to do?" The next piece was the blanket chest. Isaiah worked on it alone over 2 weeks. In the evenings after the day work, he had picked back up to keep cash moving. The tiger maple needed cleaning and a careful French polish renewal, not a full refinish. Clarence was adamant on that point. A refinish would drop the value significantly. Clarence sat in his chair at the garage door and watched and occasionally said a single sentence that redirected everything. "You're going too fast on that section. The grain's running the other direction there. Come at it differently. Let it dry completely before you do the next coat." I mean completely. Isaiah listened to every word. He had been listening to his grandfather his entire life, in the way you listen to someone who tells you things once and only once, and who assumes you were paying attention. The chest sold through Breck's network to a collector in Atlanta. The price was 3 times what Isaiah had expected when he bought the storage unit. He didn't tell anyone outside the garage. He kept working. It was during the third piece, the sideboard Clarence had touched first, that Patricia Dale appeared again. She drove into the lot at Clarence's house in a company vehicle with the Covington self-storage logo on the side. Isaiah was in the driveway when she pulled up. She got out in her work blazer and looked at the garage with its door open, the sideboard visible just inside, cleaned and cataloged and waiting. "Mr. Pruett," she said in a different register than the parking lot. "I've been hearing some things." She paused. "About the unit, about what was inside it." "What things?" Isaiah said. She didn't answer the question directly. Instead, she looked at the garage again. "I wanted to see how you were getting on, and to let you know that if there are items in that collection you're finding difficult to sell, Covington has a network of buyers. Liquidators. We've worked with them for years and they could probably take the whole lot off your hands for a fair." "I'm not having trouble selling," Isaiah said. She looked at him. "The items are selling well," he said. "Thank you for the offer." She stood in the driveway a moment longer, doing the same kind of calculation she had done in the storage facility parking lot, looking at his house, his truck, his work clothes, and coming to conclusions that the numbers in the back of Clarence's composition book would have made look foolish. "Well," she said, "good luck then." She got back in the Covington vehicle and drove out. Devin had been watching from the kitchen window. He came out after she left and stood next to Isaiah in the driveway. "Was that the storage lady?" "Yeah." Devin thought about that. "She figured it out?" "Somebody's told somebody," Isaiah said. "That's how it goes." He went back inside and kept working on the sideboard. The difficulty arrived in the 4th month, the way difficulty in this kind of work always arrived, not dramatically, but as a slow pressure on multiple sides at once. A second dealer, a man named Craig Suber, who ran a larger operation out of Charleston, and who had a reputation in collector circles that was polished on the surface and slippery underneath, made contact through the forums. He had heard about the blanket chest. He had heard about the writing desk. He mentioned both transactions in his opening message, in a way that was meant to signal that he had access to information about Isaiah's business that Isaiah hadn't given him. He offered to represent the remaining pieces. His terms were standard in structure and unfavorable in specifics. A commission percentage that would absorb most of the margin on the mid-range pieces, and a clause that gave him first right of refusal on future inventory, meaning anything Isaiah acquired afterward would have to be offered to Suber before going anywhere else. He phrased it as his opportunity. He said it twice. Isaiah showed the message to Clarence. Clarence read it without expression. He handed the laptop back. "That's a cage," he said. "I know. You going to tell him that?" "I'm going to say no. Just no?" "Just no," Isaiah said. Clarence made a sound that in 40 years of knowing him Isaiah had come to understand as approval. The no produced what no's of that kind tend to produce in tight professional circles. Suber didn't say anything directly. He didn't have to. Within 2 weeks, a version of Isaiah's background was circulating in certain forums and among certain dealers. A young man in Macon, no training, no credentials, who had gotten lucky on an estate find and was pricing above his expertise level. The implication was that the remaining pieces hadn't been properly assessed. The implication behind the implication was that a buyer who purchased through proper channels, through an established dealer, say, was better protected than one who bought directly from someone who didn't know what they had. One scheduled buyer from Birmingham went quiet. A collector in Nashville who had expressed interest in the parlor chairs stopped responding. Isaiah noticed. He didn't say anything to Devin because Devin would want to do something about it, and what Isaiah wanted to do was the opposite of something. He pulled out Clarence's composition book and sat at the workbench and wrote down exactly what he knew about the highboy. He wrote it in Clarence's style, methodical, specific, without opinion. Construction details, period indicators, condition notes. He wrote 2 pages and then he stopped and looked at what he had. He picked up the phone and called Howard Breck. Breck listened. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The piece you're describing, if your grandfather's assessment holds, needs to be formally documented before you put it anywhere near the market. You need a provenance review and a third-party appraisal from someone whose name will end any conversation about credentials before it starts." He gave Isaiah a name, Dr. Catherine Marsh. She was a retired professor of American decorative arts who had worked at the Winterthur Museum in Delaware and who occasionally did private appraisals for pieces that merited the trip. Isaiah called her the same day. Dr. Marsh arrived 2 weeks later. She came alone, driving herself in a sedan that was older than most people would expect from someone with her background. She was perhaps 70, with close-cropped gray hair and the exact manner of someone who had spent 50 years looking at beautiful things and had stopped being impressed by anything except quality. She spent 2 hours with the highboy. She didn't speak during most of it. She worked with a flashlight and a magnifying loupe and her own notes, which she made in a small bound book she carried in her coat pocket. At the end of 2 hours, she sat down in Clarence's folding chair. Clarence was inside. She had asked to meet him earlier, and they had spoken for nearly 30 minutes in the kitchen, and whatever passed between them had been quiet and complete, in a way that Isaiah hadn't tried to listen to. "Mr. Pruett," she said, "this highboy is, in my professional judgment, a Newport piece from the Goddard Townsend School of Cabinetry, approximately 1760 to 1775. It is one of the finest examples of American colonial furniture I have personally examined outside of a museum context." She paused. "The ball and claw feet are original and intact. All 7 drawers are period. The brasses are replacements, likely 19th century, but appropriate to the piece. There are no structural restorations that I can identify, which means you are looking at a piece that is essentially in original condition." Isaiah sat down on the workbench stool. "What does that mean for value?" he asked. She told him. The number she gave was a range. The lower end of the range was more money than Isaiah had ever seen in any account. The upper end was more than the house they were sitting next to. She filed her formal appraisal report 3 weeks later. When it arrived, Isaiah read it twice, put it in a folder inside Clarence's composition book, and didn't tell anyone outside the garage except Devin and Howard Breck. Breck suggested Sotheby's. The decision to consign the highboy to Sotheby's, New York, was not one Isaiah made quickly. It required conversations with Breck that lasted weeks. It required Clarence's input, delivered in the terse, practical way Clarence delivered everything. If you're going to put it somewhere real. It required a trip to New York that Isaiah had never made, to meet with specialists at the auction house, who looked at the piece in a loading bay for 4 hours and said, at the end of those hours, that Dr. Marsh's assessment was confirmed, and that the estimate for the presale catalog would be set at a range they were prepared to defend publicly. Isaiah rode the train back to Macon in a window seat and watched Georgia pass outside the glass for 4 hours and didn't open his phone once. Craig Suber found out about the Sotheby's consignment the way people in that world found things out, through the presale catalog, which was distributed to the collector community 6 weeks before the auction. Isaiah's name was in it. The piece was in it. Dr. Marsh's appraisal was referenced in the catalog notes, along with a brief description of the discovery that mentioned the storage unit without mentioning Covington Self-Storage or Patricia Dale by name. Super called Isaiah directly. It was the first time he had made contact in 2 months. His voice had a quality it hadn't had in his earlier messages, a controlled flatness that was trying to sound like equanimity and wasn't quite making it. "I want to congratulate you," Suber said. "That's a significant find." "Thank you," Isaiah said. "I also want to say, if you have additional pieces from the collection, my offer from earlier in the year stands." Isaiah thanked him again and said he'd keep it in mind. He did not keep it in mind. The auction was on a Tuesday evening in November. Devin rode the train up with Isaiah. Clarence did not come. His health made the trip impractical. But he had been clear that he wanted a phone call the moment the gavel came down. They had agreed on a specific ringtone so Clarence would know it was Isaiah before he picked up. The Sotheby's Sala Room had the particular quality of rooms where very large sums of money change hands regularly. Neutral walls, excellent lighting, a temperature that never varied, an atmosphere of professional calm that was itself a kind of performance. Isaiah wore the same clothes he had worn to meet Dr. Marsh. Devin wore a tie he had borrowed from a coworker and kept straightening it. The highboy was lot 37. The lots ahead of it moved at a measured pace. Isaiah sat without looking at his phone. Devin's beside him and was quieter than Isaiah had ever seen him. The highboy rolled into the room on a padded dolly and was positioned under the spotlights at the front of the room. Isaiah saw it from across the Sala Room and felt something he didn't have a precise word for. Not pride, not relief. Something older and more fundamental than either of those. Something that had to do with his grandfather's hands on the inlay and the smell of linseed oil, and an evening in a garage when a folded-shut unit door had rolled up like a slow exhale. The bidding opened at the low estimate. It moved steadily. It did not have the dramatic pauses and accelerations of the storage unit fantasies Isaiah had read about online. It moved the way real things moved, with the steadiness of people who had done this before and knew what they wanted. It passed the high estimate before the room had fully registered the pace. At the end, the gavel came down at a number that put the total above all but the highest projections Breck had mentioned. The room responded in the muted way Sotheby's rooms responded. A ripple of conversation. Some turned heads. A kind of collective acknowledgement that something had just happened. Isaiah sat for a moment after it was done. Then he took out his phone and dialed Clarence's number. Clarence picked up on the second ring. Isaiah told him the number. There was a silence on the other end that lasted long enough that Isaiah said, "Granddad." "I heard you," Clarence said. Another silence. "Your grandmother would have said I told you so," Clarence said. "She would have been right." Isaiah laughed. It was the first time he had laughed in the way that meant something since the day he bought the unit. On the train home, Devin slept. Isaiah looked out the window and thought about what came next, because there was a what came next. 12 remaining pieces in a garage in Macon. A business license for Pruett Restoration, a name that now appeared in a Sotheby's catalog, and a grandfather who still knew things no one else in that city was being asked to teach. He opened Clarence's composition book to a fresh page and started writing. Patricia Dale saw the Sotheby's news in a trade publication her boss had forwarded to the office staff. The article about the sale mentioned the provenance, an estate storage unit in Macon, Georgia, undocumented contents, private buyer. It did not use her name. It did not need to. She sat with the article for a long time before she printed it. She printed it anyway. She read it a second time, sitting at her desk with the facility's daily intake form in front of her, unsigned. She looked at the intake form. She looked at the article. That afternoon, she wrote a new protocol for the facility's unclaimed unit process. A 2-page document that changed how Covington handled contents assessment before any unit went to liquidation. The protocol required a basic contents inventory, photographed and filed before any sale was processed. It required that any unit flagged as estate goods be routed through a qualified appraiser before pricing. She did not call Isaiah. She did not reach out. She had too clear a sense of what that phone call would be. What she did was put the protocol in front of her district manager and say, simply, that recent events had made it apparent they were operating below the standard the industry required. Her manager asked what she meant. She told him about Unit 114. She told it without editing, without minimizing the part where she had laughed in the parking lot. Her manager looked at her for a moment. Then he said she should roll the protocol out facility-wide and write a version for the regional office. She did. In the garage on Birchwood Avenue in Macon, the work continued. Pruett Restoration took on its second paid apprentice in January, a 17-year-old from 2 streets over named Anton who had the same quality of quiet attention that Clarence said he had first noticed in Isaiah when Isaiah was 9 years old, and had watched him work for 45 minutes without asking a single question, just watching. Anton asked questions, which was a different quality, but a good one. He asked the kind of questions that meant he had been thinking before he opened his mouth. Clarence came out to the garage on the days his hands allowed. He sat in his chair at the door and watched Anton the way he had once watched Isaiah. Sometimes he spoke, sometimes he didn't. On the days he didn't speak, the quality of his silence communicated something that neither of them tried to name. Howard Breck sent leads when he had them. Estate sales, collections coming to market, private consignments that needed a restorer rather than a flipper. Isaiah took the ones that made sense and passed on the ones that didn't. He was learning what his grandfather had always known. That selectivity was itself a form of expertise. The other pieces from the original unit sold over the following year, each through the right channel, at the right time, at prices that rewarded the patients. The dining chairs went to a museum in Savannah. The bookcase went to a collector in Connecticut who sent Isaiah a short handwritten note after delivery saying it was the finest example he had owned and that he hoped Isaiah understood what he had. The parlor chairs, the original needlepoint upholstery, cleaned and stabilized rather than replaced, sold at a regional auction in Atlanta, and drew more attention than any other lot that day. Craig Suber did not bid on any of them. He was present at the Atlanta auction. Isaiah saw him across the room, and they did not speak. Suber left before the parlor chairs crossed the block. Devin came by on a Thursday evening about 18 months after the day they had first rolled up the door of Unit 114. He sat on the workbench in the garage, a cleaner, better lit, better equipped version of the space than it had been, and looked around at the 2 pieces in progress and the tool organization that had evolved over a year and a half of daily use, and the framed photograph on the wall that Isaiah had printed from the camera he'd borrowed. The highboy, in the natural light of the garage door the day after Dr. Marsh had finished her examination. "You remember that morning Frank told you about the unit?" Devin said. "Yeah." "You had $100 in your account the day it sold." "Yeah." Devin was quiet for a moment. "I should have said I believed in you." "I didn't say that." Isaiah looked at him. "You showed up," he said. "That's the same thing." Devin thought about that and didn't argue with it. In the corner of the garage where Clarence's oldest workbench had stood since before Isaiah was born, there was a composition book. Not the original. That one was archived now, too important to the business records to be left out. This was a new one, same style, same cracked spine format, with the same blocky handwriting, because that was how Clarence had written and Isaiah's had been reading it since he was old enough to read. On the inside cover, Isaiah had copied the same line Clarence had written on the inside cover of the first one. The line Clarence had told him his own father had said to him. The thing about knowing a craft is that it knows you back. Isaiah had read it so many times it had stopped being words and started being something else, the way certain true things do. The last piece from Unit 114, a small carved walnut side table that had needed the most work of anything in the collection, sold on a Wednesday afternoon to a buyer in Philadelphia who had found Pruett restoration through a mention in an antiques journal. The buyer didn't negotiate. She paid the asking price, arranged her own shipping, and sent a message afterward that said, "This is exactly what I was looking for. I'll be in touch about future pieces." Isaiah read the message sitting on the floor of the garage with his back against the old workbench, the same way Clarence used to sit when a piece was finished and the quiet after the work settled in. He forwarded it to Devin, who sent back a single response. He forwarded it to Breck, who replied with 3 words and a period. "Well done, Isaiah." He did not forward it to anyone else. He sat for a while in the quiet of the finished work. Outside, a car moved down Birchwood Avenue, and from somewhere inside the house, he could hear Clarence's television, the evening news which Clarence watched without fail and occasionally argued with. Isa Pruett had spent $2,000 on a locked unit. Nobody else had bothered to look inside. He had done it because his grandfather's voice was in his hands. and his hands knew what other people's eyes had missed. He closed the composition book and set it on the bench. There is something worth sitting with in this story, and it doesn't belong only to Isaiah. Most of us have been in the parking lot. Most of us have heard the tone of voice that Patricia Dale used when she said the word scrap. That particular certainty some people carry about who has value and what kind, which things are worth examining, and which can be handed off to whoever shows up with cash. What Patricia Dale did not do was look inside the unit, and that is the oldest mistake in the world. Not cruelty, not even arrogance, just the failure to look, to actually go inside the thing and see what is there. The people who wrote Isaiah off did not do it out of unusual wickedness. They did it out of ordinary inattention. They looked at the outside, the work boots, the East Side address, the account with $100 in it, and decided the inventory was already complete. It never was. There is a storage unit in your life that someone has already marked as junk. They have handed you the key like a joke. They have not looked inside because they are certain as they already know what's there. They are wrong in the way that people are always wrong when they stop looking. Your grandfather may have taught you something. You may have been carrying it since you were 9 years old, watching someone work in silence and learning to read what your hands were being given. It may be buried under the assumption that what you know doesn't count because no one with the right title has confirmed it yet. The unit is yours. You paid for it with years of attention. Go inside, lift the blankets, see what you have.